Good evening and welcome to our Brookings lecture tonight. Can America govern itself? Deficits, debt, and delay. We brought the big gun out tonight to handle a big problem. We're really thrilled to have Ron Haskins back. Those of you who've heard Ron talk before know you're in for a treat, and for those of you who haven't heard them, trust me, you will enjoy. We already have Ron's PowerPoint up on our website under the lecture series, so if that helps any note takers and researchers in the room, it's available to you. And the video of the lecture will be up soon as well. I'm Bill Brown of Brookings Mountain West. Again, thanks for joining us. Ron is an exemplary Brookings scholar. He's already spoken to, I think, 4 classes already this week, and we may not be done yet. He's engaged in collaborative research with some of our faculty, including Vicki right here in the front row. And you're going to hear some things that I know will raise some questions and an interesting discussion, and Ron's just the guy to handle it. Ron?
Thank you. So if a picture is worth 1,000 words, this one's worth 1,000,000 at least. I love this picture because it summarizes in one chart exactly the situation we face. And I have yet to hear anybody mount any kind of effective refutation of how serious our deficit problem is once they've seen this. So if any of you have ideas about, oh, there's something wrong here, let me know. Here's what it shows. So we have the years going across the bottom all the way out to 2083. And then we've divided the federal budget into Social Security, health programs, but primarily Medicare. Medicare's probably 75, 80% of this and getting bigger. And this is all other federal expenditures except interest, and here is net interest. And so you can see what happens as years go by. This black line is the average taxes, the average revenue that the government has, a little over 18% of GDP. All these figures are in percent of GDP. So here's what it shows. Social Security increases a little bit over the years because we have more and more people retire, but that's not a huge problem. That would not, we have to fix Social Security. It will eventually go bankrupt, but it's a modest problem that we could solve, and I think even this Congress, well, maybe not this Congress, but some Congress could solve it. But here's the problem: Medicare and other health expenditures. We're very fortunate for the last couple of years that Medicare had the growth rate of Medicare and health care in general has really moderated. And there's some people who think that that's maybe permanent or semi-permanent, that we've learned a lot about how to moderate healthcare costs. I have a friend, for example, who said to me, who often speaks with medical school classes, and told me that medical schools now often include cost containment as part of their doctor training, which is unheard of in the past. So I don't believe that, but you know, for a couple of years it's pretty good, but it's going to start growing again. And if you think about healthcare as a special kind of consumption, because you know, we feel if there's a new procedure, if they figure out how to replace knees and elbows and arms and even hearts now, Americans feel they have a God-given right to get it. Sure, they should be able to get it, regardless of income, regardless if they can pay for it. They have a right to have this medical care. And pretty much, they do have a right to get this medical care, and we pay for it, and pay for it out of public dollars. Non-interest spending, this is really important. I'm going to show you this in a couple other charts. This is, to me, this is the most important thing, other than we're going bankrupt. And that is, as you can see, it's getting smaller and smaller and smaller. This is the squeeze on everything else. Our military spending, usually in university towns, military spending is not overly popular, but I bet you like Head Start, and I bet you like housing programs and other programs for low-income families. I'll bet you like scientific research. I bet you like grants to universities. And look what's happening. And it's going to get tighter and tighter and tighter. So we are going to, in effect, we're going to cut all these kind of other spending. We're going to squeeze this other spending so that we can have more and more and more and more health care and more and more and more expensive health care. And much of it spent on people. I want you to notice the color of my hair. I'm old, okay? I don't have any brief against the elderly. I'm one. But we're going to spend it on people who are beyond their productive years, to put it mildly. And especially since we're doing that directly, or part of the way we finance it is by cutting children's programs. I'll show you that in a few minutes. So here you have the problem. Oh, and I should say something about net interest. I told a class today that there was a great economist named Herbert Stein. Many of you may have heard of him. And Herbert Stein once said, any trend that can't continue won't. And this is a trend that cannot continue. We are not going to spend 80% of our gross domestic product on, or this would be more like 45 or 50% on interest payments. And I always think of interest payments as more or less wasted. They certainly are wasted in this case. And I'm going to come back to this again and again and again. What we are doing is we are paying for current consumption of the people in this room, including me, and we're taking it from the future. We're passing a bill on to our children. I have seen a wonderful cartoon with a whole bunch of fat cats sitting around a table, and they just got the weed, and, you know, they're drooling and scraps all over the place, and a little baby seated at the table, and here comes the guy with a bill, and they're all pointing toward the baby. And that's what we're doing. That is exactly what we're doing. There's no other way to put it. So we're living high, financing current consumption by taking money from the future. That is what we're doing. And we have to stop it. And so what I want to talk to you about today is the prospects that we actually will stop it. I think all of you probably believe that deficits matter, but there are some very good reasons that we should not be running the kind of deficits we are. One that a lot of people might not think of is, where do you think we get all this money when we're living high on the hog? We borrow it from other people, and about half of the deficit is owed to foreign countries, including our close friends like the Chinese and the Saudis. Now, maybe you don't mind being in debt to them, but it makes me nervous to be so in debt to foreigners who are bound to have an impact on our foreign policy at some point. It's just not a good situation to be in, especially when, as I've already said, it's so unnecessary for us to get ourselves in this situation. Second are rising interest costs. I showed you what happens with that interest. It's unsustainable. And this is with reasonable Congressional Budget Office assumptions about interest rates. Many of you probably recall it wasn't that long ago that we had interest rates in this country at 18%, 16%. We now hardly have an interest rate. So can you imagine if it went to 8% or 10% or 15%? I mean, really, it would be I don't know what we would do. It would double the green area that I showed you in my picture worth more than 1 million words. So rising interest costs could really be a huge problem for us, especially since we're paying more and more interest every year, even at the current rates. Burden on future generations, this is something I want to talk about in detail, so I'm going to skip over it here. And the limited ability to invest in children is something I want to talk about in a minute. But those are to me, those are the most important reasons. I will confess to a certain amount of bias. I've been studying kids for most of my adult life. I'm a developmental psychologist. I have believed forever that the future is our children. And so if we're not investing in the kids and we're paying the Chinese billions and billions and billions of dollars, there's something that doesn't compute here, especially for a great nation. Then a limited ability to address emergencies. So far this hasn't hurt us, but we do have emergencies. We have Katrina, we have Sandy, we have all kinds of natural disasters, and we're forever spending money on them. We could have a war emergency. We could actually have a war that we didn't elect to get into. You know, we could feel like we had to do something. And in the past, we've always paid for it by deficit financing. But at some point, if we get to the point where we're paying too much of our budget in interest, where we can barely make our current payments, it's going to shape our thinking about how to address emergencies. So far, it hasn't had too much of an impact, but the time could come when it would. And then finally, what I call entitlement spending lockout. I'll show you a picture of that. The basic idea is, in fact, you already saw a part of it, that we're spending so much on entitlements, and it increases every year, that it's squeezing the rest of spending. So it's locking out other spending that we might want to engage in. This is my favorite picture. It took me about, I would say, a good 45 minutes to explain to these three little guys exactly how we were living high on the hog now. But once they got it, look at them. Can you believe they see, even these little kids could figure it out. You'd think the members of Congress could figure it out, wouldn't you? So future generations, this is a huge part of our program. Believe it or not, these are leeches. You can read this for yourself. This is the cover of National Journal, which is probably the most respected publication in Washington. Everybody in Washington reads it. It's like kind of like the Bible in Washington. And they put this on the cover, that the baby boomers is leeches. The baby boomers inherited an economic miracle, then they sucked it dry. This is the whole point that I've been making you. But can you believe this on the front of a very, very popular magazine in Washington? If I were a member of Congress, I would have tried to get all these and burn them. The baby boomers are, to a substantial degree, at fault here. This is an important slide because I think almost everybody would think of the first point here, that we're passing the bill to our kids. That's why those 3 little guys were crying, because we're passing them the bill. But the other point that's at least as important is that we have a lot of things that we could spend our money on that would stimulate the development of our kids. Maybe you haven't noticed this, but we have a real problem with inequality in the United States. We're the land of opportunity, except that we're not the land of opportunity, because a huge fraction of our young kids are not going to do well. We know that. We know when they're born. We know when the mother is pregnant. And we can predict that this kid is not going to do well. And you think about this disadvantage that some of these kids face. First of all, they're born to a single-parent family, which research now shows unequivocally is a huge problem for child development. Secondly, a disproportionate number of them are poor. The poverty rate among female-headed families is 5 times the poverty rate among married couple families. They live in dangerous neighborhoods. Many of them their moms don't even let them go out to play. They go to the worst schools in the country, which are also dangerous. Other than that, they have as good a chance as your kids do. So it costs money to address these issues. We are not spending enough money on these kids, especially since, as I'll show you in a minute, we have a lot of programs that we have the very best gold standard evidence, random assignment experiments, that shows that we can have an impact on these kids' development. And we never tried what I think is the real, in the long run, is going to be the solution if we can ever get the money, and that is we're going to systematically put these kids in additional programs besides our regular, normal preschool and K-12 education. We're going to put them in a series of programs, and the effects will build. We've actually done some research like this at the Brookings Institution, and we've shown that if kids are in multiple programs, it actually has a cumulative effect on their development. So we could be doing a lot to help these kids that we are not doing, and we're going to, if anything, we might be doing less if you believe the figures that I've shown you. But it's bad enough right now. Here's the way we're spending our money. This is done by a group of researchers at the Urban Institute. This is really wonderful work. And they were the first people to do that. They did it first time about 4 years ago, and they do it every year now. It's paid for by foundations. And they have a very sophisticated approach to adding up everything we spend in public dollars, both at the state level and the federal level, on kids and on the elderly. And for total public spending, for the average child, we spend $11,822. For the average elderly person, we spend $26,355. Federal spending is even more discrepant, even though it's not as much. We spend $3,882 on kids and $25,000 on the elderly. And as I've already said, this just simply does not make sense. It does not make sense to invest this kind of money in the people in our society who are least productive. Now, I bet some of you are thinking, well, there is an issue here, and that is that much of the spending on the elderly is insurance spending. They paid taxes for Social Security and for Medicare, whereas the kids have not paid any taxes. So we owe something to people because we created a program where they had to finance it themselves. The first point is that many people, in fact, a majority of people, get more out of Social Security and Medicare than they paid in. So we're passing part of that bill along to future generations as well. But in addition, the point here is that we should learn to control this spending better. And we should learn, I think, we should be willing to distribute the spending better. In other words, we should reduce Social Security payments to people who are wealthy, and we should learn to control Medicare expenditures, which I think we could do. There are lots of good ideas out there. A lot of people thought Obamacare was going to do it. I have noticed in the last month or so that there's been kind of a downgrade of confidence in Obamacare. So maybe there are more people today than a month ago who think that Obamacare is not going to reduce public spending. I've never thought it is going to, but I'm not a health expert, so I won't belabor that point. But if we did something like premium support, the flaw in our medical care generally in the United States is completely obvious to a first-year student in economics. And that is, the people who consume the medical care do not pay out of pocket. You cannot run a system where all the payments virtually are made by third parties. So they're made by insurance companies or by the government. That is a prescription for disaster, and that's exactly what we have in medical care. People have to pay a higher proportion of medical care than they do now, otherwise we'll never get the costs under control. And Representative Ryan, in a bipartisan budget, supported at first by Alice Rivlin, a famous scholar of Brookings, who's been the head of the Congressional Budget Office. She's the only person, well, no, actually, Peter Orszag, who's also from Brookings, excuse me for bragging, have been head of both the Congressional Budget Office and the Office of Management and Budget. And in addition to that, Alice was also the #2 person at the Federal Reserve. So she's a great, great expert. And she thought, and still thinks, that there's a real hope for something called premium support. I'll talk about that if anybody wants to ask me a question about it. But the point is, there are things we could do to control our medical spending more than we're doing now. So here's another product of this group of people at the Urban Institute who are doing this wonderful work on kids. Here's our spending on kids 2007 and projected 2022. So what this means projected, these are mostly CBO figures that have been worked over for this analysis by the group at the Congressional Budget Office. If we don't change the law, this is what's going to happen. This is baked in the cake right now. We could change this, but this is what's going to happen based on the laws that we have right now. So here's spending on kids. We're doing pretty well, and now it starts going down. So this squeeze that I showed you before, which was all spending other than interest and health expenditures and Social Security, there it is applied to kids. And then Social Security, as you see, goes up. Defense going down. We're squeezing defense. Probably many of you don't mind that, but there's a point beyond which we sure like to be defended. And then interest on the debt's going to go up, and of course this is only to 2022, so you don't really see that huge increase in the debt that we saw in the out years going out to, especially after 2040. And then all other outlays are also being squeezed, as I've shown you before. So this shows you for sure that if we don't change the law, we're going to spend less and less and less on our children. This is an interesting slide because it's hard to express the excitement that I feel about the direction of social science research in, I'd say, the last 2 or 3 decades in the United States, starting with the Institute of Education Sciences. We are building a huge set of programs that have been shown by large-scale random assignment studies, the best evidence you can have, that they have impacts. And some of these programs amounted in multiple sites, so it's not something peculiar to some particular location. One study, for example, Career Academies that I have up here, implemented in 8 sites around the country with thousands of kids. The welfare reform experiments, there's actually one comparison involves 55,000 people from random assignment experiments. So my point is, we are building up a body of knowledge about these programs, all of which have impacts on low-income kids, and they have positive effects on their development. And my point is, if we were spending more money on these programs, they would be producing results, and some of them, we even have benefit cost evidence that shows that the benefits would exceed the costs. Not all of them, but some of them. So we should be spending more money on these programs. If we had the money and spent it more wisely, we could address the problems of opportunity and inequality in the United States, and above all, we could address our problems in international competition between the comparisons between the performance of our children and children from other countries. We are 14th, 16th, 18th in almost all the important categories of education. So other kids from really sophisticated countries like Estonia are doing better than our kids. So it's impossible to like that. We just have to be doing more things like this, or we're going to pay a big price in the future. And I think we're paying a big price now. So let's talk about the current situation. Here is a 10-year picture, which is a lot better than the long-term picture, and shows that we actually have made some progress. There's some slight encouragement here. So you've got spending, which is, we pretty much stabilized it over the next 10 years. and we've got revenues, which we actually have increased. Some of you may recall that we had legislation a year ago that actually increased taxation, primarily on people earning over $400,000 a year. So we've increased revenues. This is a prescription for dealing with a deficit, is reduce spending and increase income. What a shocking idea, huh? Now the deficit. The deficit actually is going to decline as a percentage of GDP, although it's still growing. I'll show you this in a minute in dollars, and even in constant dollars, the deficit is still growing. And then, of course, our debt, after a very nice decline, and it just kills me that you read in the Washington Post and the New York Times, even Larry Summers did this recently, the former president of Harvard and the Secretary of Treasury, wrote an op-ed about how the debt is getting better. Well, it gets better over the next 2, 3, 4 years, and then it starts increasing again, and you get the picture that I showed you on the very first slide that I showed you, that it's out of control. We have to do something about it. The point that we could wait a while, a couple of years, while the economy recovers fully, that's probably a good point. I would agree with that myself. But you can put laws in place right now that will guarantee the savings in the out years, just like these programs that we've already passed, I'll show you those in just a minute, are actually saving money in the out years, but not enough in the out years. Here's deficit projections for 2013 to 2023, and as you can see, we made real progress. If I had shown you this 2 years ago, you wouldn't see this decline. This is a result of legislation that Congress has passed. I'll show you more in a minute. And then it starts growing again. And 10 years out, let alone 20 years out, you wouldn't know that we passed these other programs because we're off to the races and building up our deficits again. Here are rising interest costs. This is the part that really kills you. And the part is going to bankrupt the country in the long run if we keep it up. They are pretty well contained for 3 or 4 years, and then they start to gradually increase. And the further out you go, the more they increase. It's like compound interest. More and more and more and more of our money spent on paying interest, half of which goes to foreigners. Now, this is interesting. I think it'll be helpful because it shows you exactly what the nature of the problem is. So it's Social Security, health, all other, net interest and deficit, and you have years, I think this starts with 2013, I can barely see that, but in 2023, I think it's 2033, 2043, and then way out to 2083, or 83, is that right? And these are all Congressional Budget Office figures, so I'm not making any of this stuff up. I'd do that if I thought I could get away with it, but I can't. So Social Security, just like we saw in the other chart, it's increasing, but it's not too bad. We probably could do something about this. Health, though, look at this. It just explodes in the out years. Other spending, once again, we see the squeeze. Other spending declining, including children's spending, military, and so forth. And as a result, primarily of the health spending, our net interest payments explode in the out years. And as a result, our deficit explodes. So you can see exactly what the causes here are. If you want to solve this problem, yeah, we need more revenue. I'm a Republican, but we need more revenue. And it could be increased. I don't think it's necessarily increased tax rate necessarily. Other ways we can get more revenue. I'll show you one of them in a few minutes. But the big problem is we've got to contain healthcare costs. We will not be able to solve this problem unless we can control the increase in healthcare costs. And let me make a point here that I think is really important. In Washington, we would call containing this spending a cut. This is a cut. But it's not a cut in the English language. In the English language, it means if you're spending $100, a cut means you're spending 99 or less, right? In Washington, a cut means we're spending 100. Next year, we're going to spend 110, and then 120, and then 130, and then 500. And a cut is if you do anything less than what's in the baseline. That's a cut. Well, that's what we need. That's not really a cut, but that's what we need to control the growth. We can spend more money every year on health care and on Social Security. In fact, we have to if we're going to meet our obligations. But we can spend less. We can increase spending less than we are scheduled to do under the baseline. And for that, we're going to need good legislation. And for that, we need bipartisan cooperation, which I bet you've noticed is kind of difficult to get nowadays in Washington. Fortunately, it's very different. I know here in Nevada that you have great bipartisan cooperation. I've read about that. Okay, so deficit reduction, I've talked about this several times. There are 3 primary steps here. The American Taxpayer Relief Act, the Budget Control Act, and then a series of continuing resolutions in 2011. And we saved $850 billion and $1,075 billion, which is $1.075 trillion. in one piece of legislation and then $760 billion in those continuing resolutions. So the total deficit reduction, according to the Congressional Budget Office, is $2.7 trillion. So that's pretty good, right? We ought to feel somewhat good about that. But we ought to also feel rotten about it because we haven't addressed the heart of the problem, which is health care expenditures. A little teeny bit of Medicare savings in here, but hardly any. And we certainly have not made any structural changes that are going to change that rate of increase in Medicare, which is what we have to do. Here are the sequestration savings. Everybody's raving about sequestration nowadays, and it's a good reason. I'll come back to this. Defense discretionary, we're going to save $491 billion over 10 years, and you can read these figures yourself, for a total of $1.1 trillion in the sequester. So now, just on the chance there might be one or two people in the room that don't understand a sequester, I think it's worthwhile to point out what a sequester is, because it adds a brick to the big wall that we're building here. And that is, in effect, it's Congress saying to itself, you know, you don't have any self-control. We can't count on you for anything in the future. So we're going to invent something that is so horrible that if you don't do what you should do, you're going to have to experience that horrible thing. For Republicans, the sequester, so it's automatic cuts. You're going to get automatic cuts in the future. We're going to do it across the board. It's going to be totally mindless. That's what you specialize in. So even you could do this, all right? And we're going to do it to defense, and we're going to do it to discretionary spending. Of course, we're not going to do anything to entitlements, where the real problem is. We'll leave those almost completely alone, few little entitlement cuts. But we're going to do it on the discretionary side. All that other spending that I showed you before, the kids' programs, the research, the National Institutes of Health, and so forth. And so we're just going to do that automatically. And the particular situation in which it occurred, you may recall, that the Congress appointed a special committee, and they were going to think of a way to save $1.2 trillion. Well, I know it's shocking to you, but our policymakers could not agree. And so they got to sequester as a punishment. Punished all the rest of us, way more than no cuts in congressional salaries, but everybody else, we have 55 or so thousand fewer kids in Head Start because of the sequester. We've disrupted a lot of scientific research because of the sequester. We've reduced grants to universities all over the country. I'll bet there are even grants here at UNLV that were reduced because of the sequester. So this is our idea about how you control spending. You do something that in the long run is not going to be effective, that actually has negative consequences in the most mindless possible way. Cut Head Start at the same time as you cut waste. You know, it's nuts, but that's what we're doing. So now what are we going to do? We got ourselves in quite a situation for, you know, only the 11th time in 3 years or something that we've had problems with danger of closing the government, and this time we actually almost defaulted on the national debt. We came within 24 hours. That second time we've come in with a day or two of defaulting on national debt. So we appoint a committee. That's what you do in Washington, you appoint a committee. And the committee has to reach agreement. We reached the resolution on October 17th so we could open the government again and temporarily extended the authority to spend money, which is what you have to have. That's why the government closes, because the authority to spend money ends. So we have a temporary authority. I'll talk more about that in a minute. And then you appoint a conference committee. There are 22 senators, 7 representatives, and they have to write a report about how they're going to extricate us from our budget problems, and they're going to do this by December 13th. Never mind that we've been tying ourselves in knots for 5 years trying to figure out how to solve it. These guys are going to do it in 2 months. Well, I got news for you. They're not going to solve it. We will be lucky if we can even change something on sequestration. I don't think we can even do that. Now, let me tell you this about sequestration I think is really important, and I find a lot of misunderstanding about this. We often think of reducing spending as you do it and then it's reduced. And then the spending stays there for a year after. No. In a sequestration, you take, I was talking to a class today and I said, remember that Pac-Man thing, you know, gobbles up stuff? Well, sequestration's like Pac-Man. It takes a big bite 1 year, and then it comes back the next year, takes another big bite. In fact, the bite in 2014 is going to be bigger than the bite in 2013. Comes back in 2015, another bite, and so forth for 10 years. So you're talking about really, really serious, in many cases debilitating cuts by the time you get to the 10th year. And it still doesn't have that much of an impact on the deficit, and it doesn't at all touch the real problem, which I've shown you several times, is health care. It touches it slightly, maybe a delicate little touch, but nothing serious. So these guys are going to try to figure something out. Hopefully, they will at least be able to figure out how to get some savings either by increased revenue or reduced spending that will offset at least some of the cuts in sequestration. My first choice would be Head Start, maybe scientific research. And so we at least will not make all those cuts. They'll get enough money together to figure out how to offset some of those cuts, okay? Actually, the problem's a little bit further and a little bit more serious than that. I'm always worried about giving too much details and boring people to death about the dumb ways that we do things in Washington. And this is I'm going to go fast here because this is probably too much detail. So December 13th, as I've already said, the committee has to submit its report. Whether it solves anything will be another issue, but we'll find out. On January 1st, we have a batch of spending problems that if we don't solve them, there's going to be a lot of trouble. So I think we will figure out a way to solve these. The so-called doc fix, we passed a law many years ago that if health care spending exceeded a certain amount, we would cut payments to doctors. Well, let me tell you something. In America, you can't cut payments to doctors. You just can't do it. So every year since 2002, despite this law, the Congress has said, oh, we were just kidding. We're not going to pay any attention to that law. We're not going to cut those payments to doctors. Sometimes they financed it. Sometimes they didn't. It's about $300 billion. And so that hits on January 1. And the doctors may go on strike. So get all the medical care you can now before January 1st, because who knows what's going to happen. The Farm Bill won't have passed. I think the farm support prices, which, let's face it, is not all bad, they would go back to something like 1947 or some ridiculous thing. The unemployment benefits will end, which I also think is a good thing, but a lot of people don't. And then we have a whole set of tax expenditures that will expire. So this is all together, it's probably something on the order of $200 or $300 billion. Now, the Congress, many times in the past, has just said, we were just kidding, we're not going to do it. Other times they've tried to finance it. I think this time they're going to have to finance it. So they're going to have to come up with several $100 billion just to keep these going the way they have in the past. And so that'll be an adventure to watch what that on January 1st. Then on January 15th, the continuing resolution expires. That's how we can spend money. And part of the government will close, just like it did the last time, very popular with America. I can remember I was working on a House Ways and Means Committee when the Republicans had the wisdom to close the government in 1995, and then again a couple days later in 1996. And I can still hear it like it was yesterday, all these aggressive freshman Republicans saying, Americans don't care if we close the government. Nah, nobody will even notice. So as soon as the government shut down, within 48 hours there started being stories in the papers. The first one was right around Christmas about all the public employees who were not going to be able to buy Christmas presents for their kids. And then there was a story in the Washington Post, I love this one, about a family with 3 children and an old station wagon and a dog that had driven 1,000 miles to go to the national parks, probably the Grand Canyon, I don't know where it was, but went to go to a national park, and it was closed. How horrible that was, and the kids were crying and all this. In fact, the same 3 kids I showed you in the previous picture. I mean, Americans care about their government. And when you close down the government, you saw what happened the last time around. I mean, Republicans are still suffering mightily. And a lot of Republicans, just like in '96, they didn't, forgot, I guess, that they learned a lesson that if you close the government down, Americans get upset very quickly. And the media is full of stories about how horrible it is. So January 15th, they better do something about the continuing resolution. I think they will, but it won't be anything heroic, that's for sure. They'll just figure out a way to keep things more or less the way they are now, including the sequester. And as I've said, I think the main thing that we could hope for is that they'd come up with enough cash, not just to meet the doc fix, but to offset some of the sequester so we don't have to do all the horrible things that are in the across the board cuts. And then in late February or early March, The Treasury's going to run out of so-called extraordinary measures by which they do all kinds of stuff that they can borrow more money. So in the middle of March, we're going to face the problem of the debt ceiling again, and we might face the problem of a meltdown in our finances and what amounts to a default on the nation's debt. So these are the little speed bumps, as they say, that we have coming up. So stay tuned, it's going to stay exciting. And one of the goals of Washington is to keep everybody entertained. So unfortunately it makes them mad too. But all right, so a concurrent budget resolution, that is what the committee has to do. They have to come up with a concurrent budget resolution. I realize that's like a foreign term, but it's a standard budget term. They're supposed to do this every year. Every year by April 1st, we are supposed to have a concurrent budget resolution. It means that the House and the Senate have passed separate budgets. They have a conference. They agree. This is going to be the budget of the United States government. What a radical idea that the government would actually have a budget. And we would know how we're going to spend our money. We know how much income we have, and we know how much we're going to spend, and that lets us know what the deficit is. It's all planned. It's worked out. It's bipartisan. House and Senate agree. President plays no role in this. I think the last time we did this was, 6 or 7 years ago. We've never done it by April 1st, to my knowledge. So here we are. It'll be January, and we're going to have hopefully a budget resolution, so we'll know what's going to happen with our money, and the government will be able to continue function. That is the absolute minimum thing that this committee can do. So hopefully they'll at least do that. Now, in addition, they could put a lot of stuff in there. I mean, this committee has the power to recommend things to Congress that would really make serious progress. One, for example, they could do something about sequestration, which I've mentioned several times. Two, they could actually do things that would make a down payment on a deficit. They could reach a radical agreement about changing the inflation rate in Social Security, for example, which would save several $100 billion and would increase year after year after year. I think that's all but impossible for them to be able to do that. They could change Medicare reimbursement rates so that the wealthy individuals, say over $100,000 annual income or some figure like that, $150,000, would have to pay more. Their co-payments would go up, so they would pay more for Medicare. And this would not only reduce the deficit and possibly open room to offset some of those sequestration cuts, so you offset some of those and apply some of it to the deficit, but it would also be addressing the heart of the problem, which is health care. So they could do that. And they can write instructions for all the committees in Congress about, okay, Ways and Means, we want you to reform the tax code, and as a result of that, we want you to produce, name a number, $30 billion extra dollars a year over the next 10 years, increasing to $90 billion by 2023 or some such thing. They can give the committee those instructions, and if the committees don't do it under the budget rules, then the budget committee can do it for them. So, I mean, these are really extraordinary powers that if they really wanted to, we could achieve a huge end, which is putting the budget deficit on a downward path. And I've already mentioned we could reform sequestration. All right, so who's at fault? Why are we in this situation? There are three good candidates: the president, the Congress, and you and me. So what about the president? Can Obama cut a deal? This is a question I posed to you. Can Obama cut a deal? Here are our previous three presidents, and they all cut deals. They cut really good deals, mostly, that were of great importance to the country. Reagan made a bunch of reforms in Social Security. In fact, I think it set a beautiful pattern for the way we could cut Social Security now. Remember, the cut means just going to reduce the rate of growth. We're not going to actually cut it. And the real key is you do it in the future. The stuff that they decide in '83 is not yet completely implemented. That's how smart they were. You don't need to do this right now. As I showed you in that first chart, our problem really starts seriously. I think it's serious now, but it's really serious after 2030 or so. 2040 really gets huge. So and I'll show you some more about the impact this has on people's opinions about how to cut the deficit in a few minutes. 1986 tax reforms were ideal tax reforms. They also cut taxes. In fact, they eliminated taxes for something like 8 million families. They were very progressive. It was a huge achievement. And basically what happened is that Reagan and Danny Rostenkowski, the head of the Ways and Means Committee, were great buddies, even though in public they said horrible things about each other. But they drank their bourbons together, and they reached all these fine agreements on the 86 tax reforms. And Reagan increased defense spending, all done on a bipartisan basis. Clinton, my theory is the Republicans hate Clinton because he stole the main page out of their playbook. It's the page that had welfare reform, a balanced budget, and NAFTA on it. He did all those, and that's the Republican agenda, so of course they hated him. In fact, they tried to impeach him, as you remember. Every one of these, huge bipartisan votes. So Clinton did it. And Bush, no child left behind, remember that? Within, I think, 9 or 12, I forget the exact time, but the first year of his presidency, they passed No Child Left Behind. Very important energy legislation, and TARP, which was a really important piece of legislation, all bipartisan. Presidents have enormous power. Even presidents a lot of people think are not necessarily the greatest president in history. I won't tell you which one of these three I'm talking about, but you know, it's been said. And yet we're able to reach bipartisan agreement. So now we're confronted with this huge problem that really threatens the future of the country and is not just a threat to our children, but is actually harming their development as we speak right now. And we can't reach an agreement. I'm a Republican. You might think that I'm, you know, anti-Obama, but that's not true. I think a great deal of Obama. And I've written this, said it in op-eds and everything else. But I think in this case, he has not been very clever at putting deals together and sitting down with the guys, and he even smokes. He could have cigarettes with them, smoke cigars with them. Even the women, you know, who cares? Do something to establish the kind of relationships you need in order to reach these deals. It's happened a million times in the past. Here are a bunch of examples. With better presidential leadership, I think we could get a deal. I see you shaking your head.
No, sir.
No deal, okay. The Congress, what about the Congress? This is an amazing chart. This shows starting in 1982, 94, 2002, 2011, 2012. And it shows the members of the House of Representatives, and on the left side here is the most liberal Republican, and how many Democrats were more conservative than the most liberal Republican, and vice versa for Republicans. So there were 344 members of the House of Representatives who had voting records that were more centrist or moderate, so to speak, than the most radical members of the Republican and Democratic Party. And that number has declined every year, and now we've gone from 344 to 11 members of the Republican or Democratic Party. That is what's happened to the Congress, to the House of Representatives. And you can see it everywhere. You can see it in all the votes in the House of Representatives. It's amazing. It's actually amazing that we got the government open finally, and it was only because of the American public. Now, what about the American public? How about their fault? Well, I want to stand up for the public a little bit, mainly because I'm part of it. So this is a recent survey done within the past month. 800 likely voters. Those are the ones you really want to talk to because they're the ones that are actively involved and they're the ones that are going to have an impact on the government. And you say to them, would you support reform of Social Security and Medicare as part of debt reduction? And what do they say? I can show you 100 polls just like this. 34% yes. And I've already told you, we have to reform Medicare. We're not going to get out of our deficit problem. 57% no. So now you say to them, wow, okay, but what if it were gradual and would not affect anyone over age 60? Then could you support these reforms? And look at now, 55% yes, 35% no. This is exactly what the Greenspan Commission did in 83, the ones that are not fully implemented yet. So it could make a huge difference. And then you say to them, what about if we do all that and we close some tax loopholes for the rich, so they'll have to pay more in taxes? And now the vote is 61-27. I mean, that in politics, 61-27 that's like a tsunami. It just doesn't happen, okay? So my point is that the public is malleable. It depends on how you approach it. It depends what kind of deal you have. It depends on what our leaders say. It depends on if the president and the leaders in Congress agree with each other and come out holding hands. Now that's too much, not holding hands, but come out together and say, this is a good deal, it's good for the country, it's going to help us, and all these kind of things right here. We could do this. The public would accept a deal. I don't think it's a public problem. There's a lot of problems with the public, okay, I admit that, but I think the Congress could do a deal. If the president would work with the Congress and the Congress would do what it knows it has to do eventually, and will do eventually. Unfortunately, not in our lifetime, but eventually they will have to do it. And they know what it is. They have to increase revenues, and they have to cut spending, and in particular, they have to control spending in our medical programs. If they don't do that, we are really in a disaster, and our power, our influence, our future as a country will go down the tubes. Now, I've left time cleverly for one question. I'm going to let you have it since you were shaking your head the whole time I was talking.
Oh, well, thank you. I suppose you and I are old enough to remember a fellow named Ross Perot. The talk is all about the budget deficit, but we have the fewest number of people employed since 1952, I believe. And where our total revenues are only 14% of GDP that we're collecting. So
no, that isn't right. That's just wrong.
That I think that our problem is, and our trade deficit is 4% of GDP. I think the biggest thing is that, and putting people back to work. And I know there's been a lot of people write about that. How do you feel about that part of the
I agree with that. And as a result of that, I would do what most of the budgeteers have described, that if they were to, some miraculous deal, actually reach a deal, that it would really start to bite 2 or 4 or 6 years from now. We would not do it immediately because the economy is still clearly not strong again. And I would point out to you, there are a number of economists and a number of business people who feel that if we had a budget deal and you could look at a 20-year path that's really going to make a difference in our budget deficit, that would provide a level of certainty that the business community has not experienced in many years, and that would also contribute to growth. If there's anything businessmen hate, it's uncertainty. And that's what they're constantly faced with here. Closing the government, we might default on our debt. They're just, so if we could resolve all these problems, that in itself could lead to economic growth. Now let me say one more thing. I look at employment numbers very carefully. I played a big role in the welfare reform legislation 96, which depended on employment. Employment is the answer to many of our problems. And I live among economists at Brookings. I'm surrounded by economists. Oh my God, it's a horrible experience. They're everywhere. And I'm convinced that not one of them understands what's going on with employment. Really, this recession and our recovery from this recession is completely unprecedented. And there's so many measures you can look at. Long-term unemployment, 6 months or more, the number is astronomical. No other recession since the Great Depression has been like that. The Department of Labor invented another number. They have the number of job openings and the number of people looking for work. And that ratio is the highest it's been. And the recession ended 2009, that's 4 years ago. And we still have, the economists at Brookings, 2 very well-known economists at Brookings have predicted that we will not reach pre-recession levels of employment until at least 2020. And it looks to me right now like we'll be lucky to reach it by 2020. So your emphasis on employment is a very, very good thing. I don't understand what's going on, but it's really a threat. And it's especially influencing males. Males are much more likely to drop out of the work economy than females are. It's happening in the United States, it's been happening for 30 years, and it's happening in Europe. It's probably because women work more, that may be part of the problem, but anyway, employment is a big issue, I agree with you. Yes?
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Employment is it seems to be a big issue. There are certain economists who would say that back when I was in econ, full employment was 5.3% unemployment.
Yeah.
And today that's a wrong number simply because change is coming so rapidly and automation is becoming so quick.
Right.
That employed personnel can't change to keep
right.
up with automation.
And that may be true. You know, I don't know, but I can tell you this. I can remember back in the 80s, people made the same point.
Okay.
And it turned out not to be correct. We had an explosion in the 90s. I remember David Elwood, a very famous economist at Harvard, giving a talk one time about welfare reform. And he said, well, you know, he said, it's kind of dangerous to walk down the streets in Boston because they grab you and pull you in the back room and tell you they'll give you $11 an hour in benefits to make sandwiches. That's the kind of economy we have. I mean, there were lots of positions. And you know that after we passed welfare reform in 1996, in the next 4 years, the most disadvantaged group in the United States are never married mothers because of less education, less job experience. We had a 40% increase in 4 years in the percentage of never married mothers who had a job, not looking, who had a job. So those days, they seem to be gone. I hope that they're not. They're going to come back, maybe, I don't know. But if we made the right budget decisions and delayed the full implementation for 2, 4, 6 years, I have a feeling it would have a positive impact on the economy and unemployment. Yeah. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. In the back there. Sorry. I'll come back to you.
You mentioned premium support earlier as a possibility to reduce Medicare spending. I was wondering if you'd elaborate on that.
Okay, so the idea of premium, the flaw in the way we do medical care is no one pays out of pocket. It's all third-party payments. Not all, but you know, a huge percentage. More than any other good in the American economy. So premium support, the basic idea is we tell people, anybody who gets government benefits, you're going to get a fixed amount of money, which changes every year, but this is what you have. And you go into the market and you buy your own health insurance. If you spend less on your health insurance, you get to keep the change. If you spend more, that's fine. You buy whatever you want to. It's America, it's free. Buy whatever you want to, but you get a fixed amount, and that's it. Now, the idea was this would start with Medicare, so that would be primarily the elderly. And there's an issue here which a lot of the elderly, nobody in this room, and above all not me, are beginning to lose our marbles. And we can't make very clear decisions, so it'd probably be better to start with younger workers. But that was the idea. So instead of Medicare, where you just automatically get whatever you get every year and it goes up and up and up and up, you get a fixed amount of money. And how you calculate that is a big problem. By the way, this system was invented by two liberal Democrats, Bob Reischauer and Henry Aaron, who both deny paternity at this point. But I mean, at one time, and these are very, very smart healthcare experts, it addresses the main problem. You now have real money in the game, and you're looking in the market like you do for other goods. And that would be enough to control healthcare costs. So what's going to happen? The insurance companies are competing with each other to have policies. We could possibly get some of this in Obamacare with the exchanges. And that's one of the things about, really mystifies me about Republicans and Obamacare, is that if we did premium support, we have to have something like exchanges, because that's the market where these plans are in competition with each other. So that's the basic idea. It doesn't solve the employer part of health care, but it does solve, maybe not solve, but it has a chance. So there are doubters, right? But we could do it in 3, 5 states and find out if it worked. Let me point out one other thing. I think this is totally fair. This is essentially what Medicaid Part D did. It's essentially what Medicaid Part D is. And the CBO, this is the only time that I've ever experienced where the Congressional Budget Office was really wrong. They hugely overestimated the cost of Medicare Part D, the drug benefit, because it has worked so well because of competition. So if we could build that into the other healthcare expenditures, I think Part D, the experience of Part D, is a good precedent. There's a chance that it could work if we had premium support. Yes?
I have a comment and a question. I'm a CPA with 40 years of experience with our tax system, and I've seen the maximum rate at 70%. I've seen it at 25%.
Yeah.
But there's a law that is in effect that says no matter what the rate is, they've never been able to get more than 19% of GDP through the tax system. So the notion we can tax ourselves to pay for the deficit is not going to work. The second, and this is really the question.
Is that your comment?
That was the comment.
Sign me up for that comment.
Yeah, and of course your line supported that, Because it was.
Yeah, well,
dead
the
level.
line would have to, because that's the average.
Yeah.
The average is 18.3%.
That's
But I
true.
think
But-
you're
but-
essentially
but-
right,
but that's
because what
right.
happens
We
is that rich
cannot
people
tax
hire
away
ever
others.
better lawyers to figure out how to get their tax payment down. So,
My question is, I think your interest computations actually understate the problem. We're at about $20 billion or 20 trillion of accumulated national debt at the present time. We're paying about 1% on that. And our interest burden is around $220 billion a year. But you alluded to this, the average rate is more like 5%. If we apply 4% to 20 trillion, we get $800 billion every year. And so we're going to default on our debt. And you would agree with me. Everybody in this room would agree with me. We're not going to default in nominal terms. Everybody will get their principal and stated coupon, but they're not going to get it back in real terms.
because you're saying we're going to inflate ourselves out of it?
That's what's always happened throughout history. Do you deny it?
I don't know enough about the history of finance to be able to deny it, but I will tell you this, I'm more worried about another problem, which is that interest rates inevitably are going to go up.
Well, that's
And
exactly my point.
especially if we defaulted on the debt, oh my God, I don't even want to think of what would happen to interest rates.
Well,
And you already saw under entirely reasonable assumptions about the interest rate in the future, what that green part of my first chart looked like.
We're
Can
not
you
gonna
imagine
be-
if interest rates went to 10 or 12%, which they've been in the past?
But we're not going to
We're
default
getting a hint here.
in nominal terms. Everybody will get paid. They just won't get paid the same dollars they lent.
I get that.
There was a, oh, you're going to leave before we
I
get
had
to
a
the
quick
question?
question.
Okay, go ahead.
You go, Amber. I'm on the spot.
Do I know how to hold an audience?
Yes.
Is it going out the door? Do you have a question?
I have a question. So if 50% of our debt is owed to foreign countries, that means the other half is owed to ourselves.
Right.
And so, I mean, it seems like we should have more control over the interest rate. I mean, how do we lessen the debt we owe to ourselves?
Okay, I am certainly not an expert on finance, but interest rates are much like any other thing that is sold in the market. It depends on who's willing to buy it and how many people are willing to buy it, how much of it you sell. Our debt America is so reliable and has never defaulted. The Chinese are willing, they're almost willing to give us money to take their money. I mean, they're getting hardly any return on it at all. Why? Because it's safe. So it's a market mechanism. They want to be safe and they can deposit their money here. If there were more risk involved, then we'd have to pay them more. This is exactly the way it works with individuals. If you don't pay off your debts, a bank might give you money to get a car, but you're going to pay 15% interest.
Right. Are we paying, in an exact example, like if we're borrowing money from Social Security, are we still paying that interest? Aren't we borrowing a lot of money from Social Security and paying interest on that?
Yes, we are.
Okay, so we're paying interest.
Government, there's called an intergovernmental loan, and it's not reflected in our total national debt, which strikes me as bizarre.
It's not. Okay,
Right,
that's-
it's not. It's not counted as part of the public debt. So to me, that's bizarre, but that's the way we do it. And so one government agency borrows money from another government agency. So what do we have in all those billions, trillions of dollars we have in Social Security, which we're gradually spending down? We have little pieces of paper that says Agency A has an IOU to Agency B. That's what's in there. It's actually what backs it is the full faith and credit of the United States government, which we're playing roulette with now.
I apologize for making you late for class. Please?
A short question, is December 13th a Friday? A follow-up.
It's Saturday the 14th, yes.
Friday the 13th. All right, my question is, hasn't there been some work done with regard to handling some of these problems? Aren't there some paths that we can look to for help? I'm thinking, and you're using Bowles-Simpson, isn't that one of the paths that this committee has? And second...
Okay, but wait, but before you go second, I can't remember
Okay,
two things. But let me just answer the first one, take 1 second. The answer is definitely yes, but all the paths are essentially the same. They're different mixtures of more revenue and less spending. And especially you have to focus on less spending on the entitlements, and that's exactly what Bowles and Simpson do. And I'll also point out, for the benefit of the gentleman in the first row, that the president appointed the Bowles-Simpson Commission and totally ignored their report. And I think there's a lot of agreement on both sides of the aisle that that was the best chance we had to really, really deal with the deficit. And it just went by because we didn't have enough leadership from the Congress as well as from the president.
May I just follow up briefly? I think there's been some work done. Bowles-Simpson, I think I agree with your comments. But there's some other things that are sort of laying in the weeds that are potential helps. That is our own energy independence. One of our large deficit is that, in fact, we're paying our adversaries for their oil. And it appears as though there's a new oil boom. And second, we have all this money from our corporations that are overseas. Isn't there some way to repatriate it, to in fact use that profit here to deal with some of the issues that you've talked about?
Right. I know about this a little bit. It makes sense, but I'm not confident I could give you a correct answer. We're going to be energy independent. Even without the pipeline, we're going to be energy independent within 4 or 5 years. So we're headed in that direction. We could make it even better if we had the pipeline, and we'd have more jobs too. But the environmentalists are influential. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon.
I apologize, as always, for having to cut a great discussion short. Thanks for all your great questions. I have to get Ron up to a class he has to teach. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you again for joining us. I hope you can be here next week. Beth Akers will be out from Brookings. Beth is an expert on higher education, and she's going to give us an economic analysis on, is a college and university education worth it? So there's some people in this room who should really be here for that. Hope we see you all.
Yeah.